Have you ever wondered what terrified the most brutal soldiers in human history? What made hardened German commanders write panicked reports in the dead of night, begging for new strategies, new weapons, anything to counter a threat they had never anticipated? What if I told you that the answer wasn't a new tank, a revolutionary aircraft, or even a secret weapon, but something far more primal? Something that hunted them through the darkness with an intelligence they could not comprehend and a loyalty they could never break? Before we uncover what those classified patrol reports actually revealed, I need your help. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This channel depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to discover has been buried in military archives for over 70 years, and they don't want this information spreading. The year was 1943, and deep within the Hurtgen forest, along the German-Belgian border, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt sat in a dugout bunker, his hands trembling as he wrote what would become one of the most disturbing classified reports of the European theater. The paper before him was damp with condensation and something else, something that looked disturbingly like dried blood on the corners. His handwriting, normally precise and methodical, had devolved into erratic scratches that betrayed his psychological state. He wrote in German, naturally, but his words would later be translated by American intelligence officers who could barely believe what they were reading. "They are not dogs," Reinhardt wrote. "They are demons, given flesh. They move through the forest without sound. They find us when we are certain we are invisible. They know things that no animal should know. 3 of my men are gone. Not dead. Gone. Taken in the night while sentries heard nothing. Only the dogs knew. Only the dogs came." This report, catalogued as Document 7-4-23 in the archives of Military Intelligence Division, was not an isolated case. Between 1943 and 1945, over 200 similar reports emerged from German positions across Western Europe, all describing the same phenomenon: the American tracking dogs that seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to locate, pursue, and neutralize German soldiers operating behind enemy lines. But the story begins much earlier, in the pine forests of Virginia and the swamps of Louisiana, where the United States military had been developing something unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. The K-9 Corps, as it would later be known, was born from desperation and innovation in equal measure. In 1942, the War Department received increasingly alarming reports from the Pacific Theater. Japanese soldiers were conducting nighttime raids with devastating effectiveness, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, killing Allied soldiers in their sleep and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Traditional security measures were failing catastrophically. Guard duty, already a nerve-wracking assignment, had become a death sentence. Men were refusing to sleep. Entire units were suffering from severe psychological trauma. A colonel named Thomas Hammond, stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia, proposed what many considered an insane solution. Hammond had grown up in rural Mississippi, where hunting dogs were not pets, but essential tools of survival. He had witnessed firsthand how a well-trained blue-tick coonhound could track a fugitive through swamps that would swallow a human pursuer whole. He had seen how these animals could differentiate between scents that seemed identical to human noses. And most importantly, he had seen how they never forgot, never tired, and never questioned their purpose. "Gentlemen," Hammond told a skeptical panel of generals in Washington, "we are fighting this war with human limitations. We post sentries who fall asleep. We send patrols who get lost. We establish perimeters that the enemy penetrates with ease. But a dog does not sleep on duty. A dog does not question orders. and a dog can smell an enemy soldier from half a mile away in complete darkness. The generals were not convinced. Dogs had been used in warfare before, of course. The Romans used them. The Spanish conquistadors terrorized indigenous populations with war dogs. Even in World War I, various armies employed canines for messenger duties and casualty detection. But never had anyone attempted what Hammond was proposing: a systematic, scientifically designed program to turn dogs into active combat tracking units capable of operating independently in hostile territory. It took 3 more devastating months of casualties before Hammond received his authorization. In January of 1943, he was given a budget of $75,000, a training facility in the swamps outside of New Orleans, Louisiana, and permission to acquire whatever dogs he deemed suitable. What followed would change the nature of warfare forever. Hammond did not want just any dogs. He traveled across the American South for 3 months, visiting breeders, farms, and animal shelters. He examined over 800 dogs before selecting his initial group of 47. He chose bloodhounds for their unparalleled tracking ability. He selected German shepherds for their intelligence and aggression. He brought in Belgian Malinois for their speed and agility. And curiously, he also recruited several dogs that had no pedigree whatsoever, mixed breeds from the streets of New Orleans and the farms of rural Texas, animals that had survived on instinct alone. The best soldiers aren't always the ones with the finest credentials, Hammond wrote in his training manual, document K9-01. Sometimes the best soldiers are the ones who have already learned to survive when the world wanted them dead. The training program Hammond developed was unlike anything attempted before. It began with basic obedience, but quickly escalated into scenarios that would seem cruel to civilian observers. Dogs were taught to track human scent through water, through fire, through chemical smoke designed to confuse their senses. They were conditioned to ignore food, to resist the calls of other animals, to focus with absolute singularity on their assigned target. They learned to differentiate between American and enemy soldiers based on subtle differences in diet, soap, tobacco, even the oils in different military-issue uniforms. But the most controversial aspect of Hammond's program was what he called hostile engagement training. The dogs were not merely taught to find enemy soldiers, they were taught to neutralize them. A corporal named Robert Chen, who worked as an assistant trainer at the Louisiana facility, provided one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of this phase of training. His testimony, recorded in 1968 as part of a classified military history project, remained sealed until 2015. They brought in German prisoners of war, Chen stated in his interview, his voice still carrying traces of discomfort 25 years after the events. Not to hurt them, understand? But to train the dogs to recognize the enemy. These POWs were paid volunteers who wore German uniforms and were told to run, to hide, to do whatever a German soldier would do in combat conditions. And the dogs, they learned. God help me, they learned too well. Chen described exercises where German POWs were given a 30-minute head start in the Louisiana Bayou, terrain that would challenge any human tracker. The dogs, released in pairs, would locate their targets within an hour, sometimes within minutes. They learned to work as teams, one dog cutting off escape routes while another approached from behind. They learned to remain silent until the moment of contact. Most disturbingly, they learned to recognize fear and to use it. I watched a bloodhound named Colonel, big red male, about 90 pounds, Chen continued. This POW, German kid named Joseph, maybe 20 years old, he thought he was clever. He crossed 3 streams, rubbed himself with wild onions to mask his scent, climbed a tree. Colonel found him in 42 minutes. But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares. Colonel didn't bark when he found the tree. He just sat there, looking up, waiting, silent. And Joseph, he looked down and saw this dog staring at him with these intelligent eyes, and he started crying, begging in German. Colonel just waited. The dog knew Joseph would have to come down eventually, and the dog was willing to wait however long it took. By September of 1943, Hammond had trained 73 tracking teams, each consisting of 2 dogs and 1 handler. The handlers were selected with equal care, soldiers who demonstrated unusual patience, empathy, and most importantly, the ability to trust their dog's judgment over their own instincts. These men formed bonds with their animals that transcended typical military discipline. They learned to read minute changes in their dog's body language, to understand signals invisible to untrained observers. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, handler of a German shepherd named Phantom, described this relationship in a letter to his wife in Austin, Texas. The letter, discovered in 2010 among Webb's effects after his death, provided a rare glimpse into the psychological reality of working with these animals. Sarah, Webb wrote, "I know this will sound strange, but Phantom knows things before I do. Yesterday on patrol, he stopped dead on a trail. No visible reason. I couldn't hear anything, couldn't see anything. But he refused to move forward, stood there rigid, staring at a spot about 50 yards ahead. I trusted him. We took an alternate route. 2 hours later, we found out there had been a German ambush position exactly where Phantom stopped. 3 machine gun nests. If we'd continued, our entire unit would have been slaughtered. How did he know? The wind was wrong for scent. We were too far for sound. But he knew, Sarah. He absolutely knew." These tracking teams were first deployed to the European theater in October of 1943, assigned to various units conducting operations along the German border. Military leadership remained skeptical, viewing them as experimental at best, a waste of resources at worst. That skepticism would not last long. The first incident that changed German perceptions occurred on October 27, 1943, near the Belgian town of Eupen. A German reconnaissance unit, 8 soldiers led by Sergeant Wilhelm Kruger, had infiltrated American lines with orders to gather intelligence on troop movements and supply routes. They were experienced, careful, and confident. They had conducted similar missions a dozen times before without detection. They did not know about the tracking teams. The American unit they had infiltrated, 3rd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, had recently been assigned a tracking team, a handler named Corporal James Mitchell from Alabama, and 2 Belgian Malinois named Tracker and Shadow. When the German unit's infiltration was suspected but not confirmed, Mitchell was ordered to verify. "We picked up the scent at 0300 hours, Mitchell reported in his after-action summary. Tracker indicated 8 individuals, non-American, moving northeast. Trail was 6 hours old but clear. We followed at double time. Tracker and Shadow were pulling hard, eager. They knew we were hunting humans, and they knew these humans were prey." The German unit, despite their training and experience, made a fatal error. They assumed they were invisible, and therefore became careless. They stopped to rest in the abandoned farmhouse 3 miles behind American lines. Confident they had not been followed, they posted 1 sentry and allowed the others to sleep for 2 hours before continuing their mission. The sentry never heard Mitchell's approach. The tracking dogs moved through the darkness with absolute silence, generations of hunting instinct compressed into pure predatory efficiency. Mitchell later described the moment with an almost poetic horror. Tracker reached the farmhouse first. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just pressed himself against the wall near the door and looked back at me. His eyes were reflecting the moonlight, and I swear he looked pleased. Shadow circled to the back entrance. These animals had done this before in training, but this was their first real hunt, and they knew it. I could feel their excitement, their focus. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Mitchell signaled for backup, and within 20 minutes, a full platoon had surrounded the farmhouse. The German soldiers surrendered without firing a shot, completely demoralized by the realization that they had been tracked and cornered without having any idea they were being pursued. When Sergeant Kruger was interrogated, he kept asking the same question in broken English. "How did you find us? How did you know where we were?" The interrogator, a lieutenant named David Park, pointed at Tracker and Shadow, who sat calmly beside Mitchell. "They found you. They always find you." Kruger stared at the dogs for a long moment, and then, according to Park's interrogation report, he said something chilling. "We cannot hide from them. We cannot escape them. You have brought devils to this war." Word of this incident spread through German military channels with unexpected speed. Within 2 weeks, German intelligence had compiled its first official report on American tracking dogs, distributed to all units operating along the Western Front. Document captured after the war, catalogued as Enemy Intelligence Assessment 14-K, made for disturbing reading. The report, written in clinical German military prose, began with standard assessments of American dog capabilities. But as the document progressed, the language shifted from analytical to almost fearful. The anonymous German intelligence officer who compiled the report noted that American tracking dogs demonstrated abilities that exceeded known parameters of canine capabilities. The dogs appeared to track soldiers through conditions that should have made scent tracking impossible. Through rain, through chemical smoke, even through streams and rivers. They worked in coordinated pairs, displaying tactical awareness that suggested intelligence beyond animal instinct. Most disturbing to German commanders, the dogs showed no fear of gunfire, no hesitation in pursuing their targets into dangerous terrain. The report concluded with a recommendation that sent shock waves through German military leadership. American tracking dog units should be classified as priority threat targets. Elimination of these units should be considered equal priority to elimination of artillery positions and armored units. Standard infantry tactics are insufficient against these animals. New countermeasures must be developed immediately. But developing countermeasures against an enemy that operated primarily through senses invisible to humans proved nearly impossible. German soldiers attempted various strategies to evade or confuse the tracking dogs. They tried masking their scent with local vegetation, with animal carcasses, with captured American uniforms. They tried splitting their units and taking parallel paths to confuse the trail. They tried laying false trails, doubling back, moving only through water. None of it worked consistently. The dogs adapted to each countermeasure faster than new ones could be developed. A particularly haunting account came from Unteroffizier Heinrich Müller, a German soldier captured in December of 1943 near Aachen. His interrogation, conducted by an American intelligence officer named Captain Richard Lawson, was recorded and transcribed. The transcript remained classified until 1998. "They are not natural," Muller insisted during his interrogation, his English heavily accented but clear. "I have hunted since I was a boy in Bavaria. I know dogs. These are not dogs as we understand them. They do not behave as animals. They behave as soldiers." Captain Lawson pressed him for specifics. "My unit was ordered to conduct sabotage behind your lines," Muller explained. 6 of us. We moved only at night. We buried our waste. We ate only cold rations to avoid cooking smells. We were careful, so careful. On the 3rd night, we heard nothing, saw nothing. But Dieter, he was our youngest, he stopped walking. just stopped. And he said, "They are here." We asked him what he meant. He said, "The dogs. I can feel them watching us." Mueller paused in his testimony, and according to Lawson's notes, his hands were shaking. "We thought Dieter was having mental breakdown," Mueller continued. "The stress of being behind enemy lines, yes? But then we saw them. 2 dogs, maybe 50 meters away, just sitting there in the moonlight, watching us, not barking, not approaching, just watching. And we knew, all of us knew in that moment, that we were already caught. We could run, but they would follow. We could hide, but they would find us. We could fight, but more would come. We surrendered right there." Dieter was crying. The rest of us were too frightened to feel shame. When Lawson asked Mueller how his unit had known the dogs were there before seeing them, Mueller gave an answer that appeared in multiple German accounts. "You can feel them. Like you can feel when someone is staring at you, yes? But stronger. These animals, they project intention. When they are hunting you, you know. Your body knows even when your mind does not believe. It is primal. It is terror from before civilization, when humans were still prey animals. These dogs, they remind us what it means to be prey." This psychological impact, the terror that preceded actual contact with the tracking dogs, became one of their most effective weapons. German soldiers operating behind American lines were no longer merely worried about being caught. They were consumed by the knowledge that invisible hunters were potentially following their every move, animals that could track them through any terrain, under any conditions, and that would never stop, never tire, never forget their scent. By January of 1944, German military leadership had issued special directives regarding American tracking dog units. Soldiers were ordered not to attempt infiltration missions unless absolutely necessary. When such missions were required, units were instructed to move in larger groups, hoping that numerical superiority might deter or overwhelm any tracking teams they encountered. They were also ordered to carry specific weapons and ammunition designated for anti-dog use, including shotguns loaded with heavy shot and even crude poison-tipped projectiles. These measures had limited success. The tracking teams adapted quickly to German countermeasures, and the dogs themselves seemed to possess an almost preternatural ability to detect threats before handlers were aware of them. Handler casualties remained surprisingly low compared to other combat units, a statistical anomaly that military analysts struggled to explain. The dogs, it seemed, were not only protecting themselves, but also protecting their human partners. One incident that particularly terrified German soldiers occurred in February of 1944 near the town of Monschau. A German special operations unit, hand-picked veterans with extensive experience in covert operations, was tasked with infiltrating deep behind American lines to destroy a key supply depot. The unit consisted of 12 soldiers, led by Hauptmann Otto Richter, a decorated officer with 7 years of combat experience across 3 theaters of war. The mission began successfully. The German unit penetrated American lines under cover of a winter storm, using weather conditions that should have made tracking impossible. Heavy snow was falling, temperatures had dropped well below freezing, and visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The Germans moved with confidence, certain that even if their infiltration had been detected, no pursuit could follow them under such conditions. They were catastrophically wrong. An American tracking team, handler Sergeant Paul Henderson from Montana, and 2 bloodhounds named Smoke and Thunder, had picked up the German trail within hours of the infiltration. Despite the snowstorm, despite the freezing temperatures, despite conditions that should have obliterated any scent trail, the bloodhounds followed the German unit's path with unwavering certainty. "I don't understand how they did it," Henderson wrote in his personal journal, an entry dated February 9, 1944, "The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see Smoke in front of me, even though he was only 10 feet away. But he never hesitated. He never showed confusion. He just kept moving forward, pulling me through the storm like he could see something I couldn't." Thunder was the same. "These dogs were tracking something, but I still don't know what. The snow should have erased the scent within minutes. But they knew. They always knew." The German unit, unaware they were being pursued, stopped to rest in a dense forest grove, confident the storm provided complete concealment. They posted sentries, but the sentries were watching for human threats, not for animals capable of moving through a blizzard without making a sound. Smoke and Thunder found them at 0400 hours. Henderson, following his dogs through the darkness, suddenly saw Smoke stop and drop into a crouch, a signal the dog had been trained to give when targets were extremely close. Henderson signaled for the backup platoon that had been following at a distance, then waited. "I could hear the Germans talking," Henderson recorded in his journal. "They sounded relaxed, confident. They had no idea we were 20 yards away." Smoke was trembling, not from fear, but from restraint. Every instinct in his body was telling him to charge forward, to attack, to complete the hunt. But he held position, because I told him to. The discipline these animals demonstrated under stress was beyond anything I'd seen in human soldiers. When the backup platoon arrived and surrounded the German position, the Americans called for surrender. The Germans' initial response was disbelief. Hauptmann Richter shouted back in English, demanding to know how the Americans had found them. When told that tracking dogs had followed them through the blizzard, Richter's response, recorded in the subsequent interrogation report, became infamous among American intelligence officers. "That is impossible. No animal can track through such conditions. You are lying. You must have a traitor among my men." But there was no traitor. There was only Smoke and Thunder, sitting calmly in the snow, tongues hanging out, tails wagging slightly, looking for all the world like ordinary dogs enjoying a winter evening. The interrogation of Hauptmann Richter and his unit provided American intelligence with perhaps the most comprehensive insight into German psychological responses to the tracking dogs. The interrogations were conducted over a period of 5 days at a facility near Luxembourg, and the transcripts revealed something unexpected. The German soldiers were not merely frightened of the dogs. They were fundamentally disturbed by them, as if the animals had violated some unspoken rule of warfare. "War has rules," Richter stated during his third interrogation session. "Not written rules, perhaps, but understood rules. Men fight men. Machines fight machines. But these dogs, they exist outside these rules. They are neither men nor machines. They are something else entirely. They track us through conditions that defy explanation. They coordinate with each other in ways that suggest intelligence beyond animal capacity. And worst of all, they seem to enjoy the hunt." This last observation appeared repeatedly in German accounts. The dogs were not performing a task reluctantly. They were enthusiastic, almost gleeful in their pursuit of enemy soldiers. Handlers noted that their dogs became excited when ordered to track, displaying behaviors similar to hunting dogs preparing for a chase. But unlike traditional hunting dogs pursuing game animals, these military tracking dogs were pursuing human beings, and they appeared to understand the difference. Dr. Eleanor Grant, an Army veterinarian assigned to monitor the health and psychological state of the tracking dogs, kept detailed medical records that inadvertently documented this phenomenon. Her notes, preserved in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, contained observations that troubled her even as she recorded them. The dogs demonstrate clear preference for tracking missions over other duties, Grant wrote in a report dated March 1944. When handlers prepare for tracking operations, the dogs show elevated excitement, increased heart rate, and focused attention. They appear to be anticipating the mission with what can only be described as eagerness. This is normal for working dogs. However, what concerns me is the dog's behavior after successful tracking missions. They display satisfaction behaviors, relaxed posture, what handlers describe as pride. These are animals that have hunted human beings and found pleasure in the success. I struggle with the ethical implications of what we have created. Grant's ethical concerns were not widely shared among military leadership. The tracking dogs were proving devastatingly effective, and effectiveness was the only metric that mattered in wartime. By spring of 1944, German infiltration attempts had decreased by over 60% in sectors where tracking teams were deployed. When infiltrations were attempted, success rates had fallen from approximately 70% to less than 15%. The dogs were winning a psychological war that had nothing to do with conventional tactics or firepower. But the German military was not prepared to concede defeat. In April of 1944, German intelligence compiled what became known as the Hundabwehr document, a comprehensive manual for countering American tracking dogs. The document, recovered after the war from a destroyed German headquarters in Aachen, represented months of research, field observations, and desperate experimentation. The manual began with a frank admission that previous countermeasures had failed. It then proposed a series of increasingly extreme tactics. German soldiers were instructed to carry strong-smelling chemicals to mask their scent, including ammonia, turpentine, and even gasoline. They were taught to move exclusively through water when possible, to avoid leaving scent traces on vegetation or soil. They were ordered to change clothing frequently, to carry extra uniforms that could be discarded to create false trails. Most disturbingly, the manual instructed soldiers to carry weapons specifically designed to kill dogs, including crossbows with poisoned bolts that could be fired silently. If confronted by American tracking dogs, the manual stated, soldiers should remember that these animals, despite their training, retain animal instincts. They can be frightened. They can be injured. They can be killed. Do not allow psychological intimidation to prevent appropriate defensive action. These are tools of the enemy, not supernatural beings. They bleed. They die. Treat them as you would treat any enemy combatant. This directive represented a significant shift in German military policy. Previously, dogs had been considered quasi-civilian assets, animals caught in human conflicts. Now they were officially designated as enemy combatants, legitimate targets to be destroyed on sight. This change would have catastrophic consequences for both sides. The first incident under this new policy occurred on April 23, 1944, near the town of Prüm. A German patrol encountered an American tracking team consisting of Corporal Vincent Shaw from Louisiana and his German shepherd named Baron. The German patrol, following their new directives, opened fire immediately, not on Shaw, but on Baron. The dog was hit 3 times, wounds that would have killed most animals instantly. Baron did not die instantly. Shaw's after-action report, submitted from a field hospital where he was being treated for injuries sustained during the firefight, provided a harrowing account of what followed. Baron went down, and I thought he was dead, Shaw wrote, his handwriting shaky from painkillers. The Germans were advancing, confident they had neutralized the threat. But Baron got up. I don't know how. He had 3 bullets in him, 1 in his chest, and he got up. And he went for them. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just charged. The Germans panicked. They were expecting an injured animal to retreat, to hide. Instead, Baron attacked like he wasn't injured at all. He brought down 2 soldiers before the rest fled. By the time reinforcements arrived, Baron had collapsed, He died in my arms 15 minutes later. His last act was licking my face. He was still trying to comfort me even as he was dying. Barron was posthumously awarded the Dickin Medal, the highest honor for military animals, though the award would not be created until later in the war. His handler, Shaw, was evacuated to the United States for physical and psychological treatment. He never returned to combat duty. In interviews conducted years later, Shaw remained adamant about one detail that many found difficult to believe. Barron knew he was dying, Shaw insisted. Animals understand mortality, but he chose to attack anyway because that was his job, that was his purpose. He was a soldier, and he died like a soldier. People think I'm anthropomorphizing, projecting human qualities onto an animal. But I was there. I looked into his eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing. Barron's death marked a turning point in how American forces deployed and protected their tracking teams. Dogs were now accompanied by larger security details. Handlers were trained in combat tactics beyond basic self-defense. Most significantly, a new protocol was established. Any enemy forces that killed or injured tracking dogs would be pursued with extreme prejudice, a euphemism for retribution that often meant prisoners were not taken. This escalation disturbed some American officers who worried about violations of conventional warfare protocols. A memo from Colonel James Peterson, commanding officer of the 20th Infantry Division, expressed concerns that were shared but rarely voiced officially. "We are asking our men to treat dogs as fellow soldiers," Peterson wrote in a memo to his superiors dated May 1944. "This creates a moral complexity that concerns me. When a dog is killed, handlers react with a level of emotional intensity that sometimes exceeds their reactions to human casualties. They seek revenge. They take unnecessary risks. Yesterday, a handler named Jackson pursued a German patrol for 6 miles into enemy territory after his dog was shot. He killed 3 German soldiers before being wounded and extracted. When I spoke with Jackson in the hospital, he showed no remorse, only satisfaction that he had made them pay for what they did to Ace." This level of attachment, while perhaps beneficial for dog-human working relationships, is creating soldiers who may not be thinking clearly in combat situations. Peterson's concerns were noted, but ultimately dismissed. The tracking dog program was too successful to modify based on psychological considerations. By summer of 1944, over 200 tracking teams were operating across the European theater, from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Italy. German soldiers feared them universally, and that fear was becoming a weapon in itself. But something else was happening, something that German intelligence was beginning to document with increasing alarm. The dogs were changing, adapting, evolving in ways that exceeded their training. They were learning from experience in real time, developing tactics that had never been taught to them. A classified German intelligence report from June 1944, recovered from archives in Berlin after the war, described incidents that German officers found almost impossible to accept. The report, signed by Oberst Friedrich Hartmann, detailed multiple encounters where American tracking dogs demonstrated behaviors that suggested sophisticated tactical reasoning. In 3 separate incidents this month, Hartmann wrote, "Our soldiers have reported identical behavior from American tracking dogs. The dogs, working in pairs, have begun employing ambush tactics. One dog will pursue visibly, pushing the target toward a specific location. The second dog will position itself in advance along the predicted escape route. When the target attempts to evade the pursuing dog, they encounter the second dog waiting in concealment. This is not pack-hunting behavior as observed in wild canines. This is coordinated tactical maneuver." The report continued with even more disturbing observations. German soldiers reported dogs that appeared to anticipate their movements before they made them. Dogs that seemed capable of distinguishing between armed and unarmed soldiers, targeting the armed threats first. Dogs that would sometimes release captured soldiers unharmed if they surrendered immediately, but would pursue relentlessly those who attempted to flee or fight. These animals are making judgment calls, Hartman concluded in his report. They are assessing threats, calculating odds, choosing courses of action. This exceeds training. This suggests intelligence that approaches, perhaps equals, human reasoning capacity in certain limited contexts. I do not make this assertion lightly. I have interviewed dozens of soldiers from multiple units. Their testimonies are consistent. These dogs are not merely following commands. They are thinking. Those American handlers had made similar observations, though they were reluctant to describe them in official reports for fear of seeming irrational. Private conversations, letters home, and diary entries told a different story. Handlers consistently described their dogs as partners rather than tools, intelligent beings with whom they communicated through methods that transcended standard training commands. Sergeant Donald Wright, handler of a Belgian Malinois named Reaper, kept a detailed diary throughout his service in Europe. The diary, donated to the Library of Congress by his family in 2003, contained entries that read less like military journals and more like correspondence between friends. Reaper understands context in ways I can't explain. Wright wrote in an entry dated July 7, 1944, "Yesterday we encountered a German soldier, young kid. Couldn't have been more than 17. He was wounded, no weapon visible. Reaper tracked him to a barn where he was hiding. But when we entered, Reaper didn't attack. He just sat down and looked at me like he was saying, 'This one's no threat.' I searched the kid, found no weapons, called for medics. Reaper was right. But here's what troubles me. How did he know? He's trained to locate enemy soldiers, not to assess threat levels. Yet he assessed. He made a judgment call, and his judgment was correct." These accounts of apparent reasoning in tracking dogs became increasingly common as the war progressed. Dogs that would aggressively pursue armed enemy soldiers, but would ignore or even guard wounded ones. Dogs that seemed capable of distinguishing between enemy soldiers actively engaging in combat operations versus those attempting to surrender or desert. Dogs that would track through villages without disturbing civilians, but would immediately alert when military targets were present. Colonel Thomas Hammond, the architect of the Tracking Dog program, attempted to study this phenomenon in the final year of the war. His research notes, fragmentary and incomplete due to the chaotic conditions of the European theater's final months, suggested he was both fascinated and disturbed by what his program had created. "We trained them to track and apprehend enemy soldiers," Hammond wrote in notes dated February 1945. "But they have learned things we did not teach. They have adapted beyond their programming. I watch these animals work, and I see something that makes me profoundly uneasy. We have taken creatures that already possessed remarkable natural abilities, and we have focused those abilities into weapons. But in doing so, have we created something that we cannot fully control? These dogs still obey their handlers, but I wonder if that obedience is given freely, or if it is merely convenient for them to obey. What happens if they decide otherwise?" Hammond's concerns were never formally addressed. The war ended in May 1945, and the Tracking Dog program was rapidly dismantled as part of general demobilization. Dogs were either returned to civilian life, transferred to police departments, or in some cases kept by their handlers who refused to surrender them. The program itself was classified, its records scattered across multiple archives, its successes minimized in official histories. But the German documents tell a different story. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, thousands of military reports were seized by Allied forces. Among these documents were personal accounts, diary entries, and letters that had never been intended for official consumption. These documents, many of them only recently declassified and translated, paint a picture of absolute psychological devastation caused by the American tracking dogs. A letter from Gefreiter Paul Schneider to his brother, dated March 1945, was found in a destroyed post office in Cologne. Schneider was part of a German unit attempting to establish resistance positions in the Ruhr Valley. His letter, never delivered, provided insight into the final collapse of German morale. "Hans, I do not think I will survive this war," Schneider wrote. "Not because of American tanks or artillery, but because of the dogs. They are everywhere now. We cannot move without knowing they might be tracking us. We cannot rest without fear that they are already surrounding us." Last night, Klaus broke down completely. He was crying, saying he could hear dogs in the distance, even though there was no sound. The lieutenant told him to pull himself together, but I think we all hear them now. Real or imagined, it doesn't matter. They are in our heads. They have defeated us not with violence, but with fear. I would rather face an entire American battalion than encounter one of those dogs alone. This psychological collapse, replicated across German forces in the war's final months, represented perhaps the tracking dogs' greatest victory. They had not merely located enemy soldiers. They had broken the enemy's will to fight. But this victory came with costs that would not be fully understood for decades. After the war ended, Colonel Hammond attempted to track what had happened to the dogs from his program. Of the original 73 dogs that had been deployed to Europe, only 31 had survived the war. Of those survivors, 9 were euthanized due to injuries or trauma. The remaining 22 were distributed to various civilian and military organizations. Hammond tried to maintain contact with the handlers who had taken their dogs home, conducting informal follow-up interviews. What he discovered troubled him profoundly. Multiple handlers reported that their dogs had never fully transitioned back to civilian life. They remained hypervigilant, constantly scanning their environments, reacting to scents and sounds invisible to their human companions. Some dogs became aggressive toward strangers who matched profiles similar to German soldiers, behaviors their handlers could not break despite extensive retraining. Most disturbingly, several handlers reported that their dogs seemed to be waiting, as if they expected to be called back to service at any moment. "Phantom has been home for 6 months," Lieutenant Marcus Webb wrote to Hammond in November 1945. "He lives with me and Sarah in Austin. On the surface, he seems like a normal dog. He plays in the yard. He sleeps on the porch. But Sarah says she catches him sitting by the front door sometimes, just staring out at the street. Not like he's waiting for me to come home. Like he's waiting for orders. And twice now, he's reacted to men wearing certain types of clothing. Workwear that, I guess, reminds him of military uniforms. He doesn't attack, but he watches them with an intensity that frightens Sarah. It's like he never really left the war. Part of him is still in those European forests, still hunting." Hammond compiled these accounts into a final report on the tracking dog program, submitted to the War Department in January 1946. The report recommended that future military working dog programs include extensive protocols for psychological decompression and rehabilitation. It also included a warning that remained classified until 1995. "We have learned that we can train dogs to track and apprehend enemy soldiers with remarkable efficiency," Hammond wrote. "But we have also learned that in doing so, we create animals that cannot easily return to peaceful existence." The psychological impact on these dogs is profound and perhaps permanent. Future programs should carefully consider whether the military benefits justify the cost to the animals themselves. we have a moral obligation to these creatures who served alongside human soldiers with equal courage and perhaps greater sacrifice. This moral question was largely ignored in subsequent decades. Military working dog programs expanded dramatically during the Cold War, deploying thousands of dogs in various capacities across multiple conflicts. The tracking techniques pioneered by Hammond's program were refined and standardized, but the psychological costs, both to dogs and handlers, remained inadequately addressed. The German documents, meanwhile, passed into historical obscurity. Most were filed away in archives, accessible only to researchers with specific security clearances and academic justifications. The full extent of German psychological trauma caused by American tracking dogs remained largely unknown to the general public. The few accounts that did surface were often dismissed as exaggerations, wartime hysteria, or deliberate misinformation designed to excuse German failures. But in 2012, a researcher named Dr. Catherine Mills, working in the German Federal Archives in Freiburg, discovered a cache of previously uncatalogued documents from a former East German military intelligence facility. Among these documents was a psychological study conducted by Soviet researchers in 1946, examining German prisoners of war who had encountered American tracking dogs during the war. The study, based on interviews with over 300 German soldiers, documented levels of post-traumatic stress that exceeded those found in soldiers who had experienced conventional combat trauma. Subjects consistently describe encounters with American tracking dogs as among their most terrifying wartime experiences. The Soviet researchers noted, multiple subjects reported recurring nightmares featuring dogs hunting them through forests. Subjects described feeling perpetually watched, constantly pursued, unable to escape even in dreams. The psychological impact appears disproportionate to the actual physical threat posed by the dogs, suggesting that these animals triggered primal fear responses that conventional military threats do not activate. Several subjects requested to remain in prisoner of war camps rather than be released and possibly encounter these dogs again, even though the war had ended months previously. Dr. Mills published her findings in 2014, reigniting academic and public interest in the American tracking dog program. Her work prompted renewed examination of both American and German archives, leading to the declassification of additional documents and the discovery of personal accounts that had been overlooked for decades. One of the most significant discoveries was a series of letters exchanged between former German soldiers in the 1950s and 60s. These men, now living as civilians across West Germany, maintained correspondence about their wartime experiences. Multiple letters referenced the tracking dogs, always in terms that suggested the fear had never fully dissipated. "I saw one again yesterday," wrote former Unteroffizier Hans Mueller in a letter to a fellow veteran dated June 1958, 13 years after the war's end. "German Shepherd, probably a police dog, with an officer in München. The moment I saw it, I was back in those forests. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking. The dog looked at me, just a glance, and I felt that old terror return. I know it is irrational. I know that dog has nothing to do with the war. But my body remembers. My body knows what those animals can do. I am 52 years old, and I am still frightened of a dog." These accounts suggest that the psychological impact of the American tracking dogs extended far beyond the war itself, creating trauma that persisted for decades in survivors. The dogs had not merely served as military assets. They had become symbols of an unstoppable force, predators that operated according to rules beyond human understanding, hunters that could never be fully escaped. And here, at the end of this story, we must confront a disturbing question. The tracking dogs of World War II are long dead, their handlers mostly gone as well. The program that created them has been superseded by more advanced training methods and technologies, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Military forces around the world continue to employ dogs in tracking, detection, and combat roles. These animals are trained using techniques descended directly from Hammond's program. They are deployed in conflicts where they create the same psychological impact that terrified German soldiers over 80 years ago. Are there soldiers, right now, in conflicts around the world, experiencing the same primal terror that Unteroffizier Meller described? Are there men and women in forests, in deserts, in mountains, who know they are being hunted by animals they cannot see, cannot hear, cannot escape? And if so, what psychological scars are we creating that will persist long after current conflicts have ended? The German documents revealed that the tracking dogs were more than weapons. They were catalysts for trauma that transcended normal combat stress, tapping into fears buried deep in human evolution when our ancestors were prey as often as predators. We thought we had evolved beyond such fears. The tracking dogs taught us otherwise. In the end, perhaps that is the most disturbing revelation in those captured German patrol reports. They showed us that despite our technology, our civilization, our military might, we remain animals. And animals can still be hunted. If this story has disturbed you, if it has made you question the costs of war beyond the obvious casualties, then perhaps there is still time to seek comfort in something greater than human conflict. The wars of this world will continue, and the suffering they create will persist. But there is a path beyond fear, beyond trauma, beyond the endless cycle of hunter and hunted. That path leads to God, to Jesus Christ, to a love and grace that transcends the darkness we create. In a world where we train animals to hunt each other, where we turn creation itself into weapons, we desperately need the redemption that only faith can provide. Seek God. Seek Jesus. Find the peace that this world cannot give. And if you encounter a military working dog today, remember what it represents. Not just training and service, but a legacy of terror carefully cultivated and deployed. Remember that behind those intelligent eyes is an animal that has been shaped by human hands into something beyond natural design. And ask yourself if we have the right to make such changes, to create such fear, in creatures that have no choice but to serve us.